Home is supposed to be the safest place in the world. The people who tuck you in at night, who make your meals, who hold your hand when you are scared, those people are supposed to be the reason you feel safe, not the reason you should be afraid. But for the children in every single case you are about to hear, the greatest danger was not a stranger. It was not someone who broke in through a window or followed them home from school. It was the one person on earth who was biologically and legally bound to protect them, their mother. These are not cases from the distant past that history has forgotten. Some of them changed laws. Some of them exposed failures in entire government systems. Some of them still do not have satisfying answers even decades later. Today we are covering 10 mothers who took the lives of their own children, and in some cases their entire households. Cases that investigators, courts and the public have never fully been able to make sense of. Case 1. Andrea Yates. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in Clear Lake, Texas, on June 20th, 2001. Russell Yates kissed his wife goodbye and left for his job at NASA, where he worked as a space shuttle engineer. His wife Andrea was 36 years old, a former registered nurse, and the mother of 5 young children. Noah was 7, John was 5, Paul was 3, Luke was 2. Baby Mary was just 6 months old. By the time Russell came home that afternoon, all 5 of them would be gone. Andrea grew up in Houston as the youngest of 5 children. She was the kind of student every teacher remembered, valedictorian of her high school class, captain of the swim team, officer in the National Honor Society. She went on to get her nursing degree from the University of Texas and spent 8 years working as a registered nurse at the MD Anderson Cancer Center, one of the top hospitals in the country. She met Russell Yates in 1989 at an apartment complex they both lived in. They got married in April 1993. By all outward appearances, they were a happy, stable, deeply religious couple. The children started coming quickly. Noah was born in 1994, then John in 1995, Paul in 1997. Things were moving fast, and Andrea was carrying a lot. She was homeschooling the children, managing the household almost entirely on her own, and leaning heavily into the religious teachings of a travelling preacher named Michael Warrenecki, who believed that bad mothers would produce bad children, and that bad children were destined for eternal punishment. Russell had followed Warrenecki for years, and the family lived for a time in a converted bus so they could travel and attend his teachings. Andrea took those ideas deeply to heart, in a way that would later be described by psychiatrists as catastrophic. In 1999, after the birth of her 4th son, Luke, Andrea Yates broke down completely. She stopped eating, she stopped talking, she sat and stared at the wall for hours. She scratched at her own skin repeatedly. On 2 separate occasions that year, she attempted to take her own life. The first time, she grabbed a kitchen knife. The second time, she took an overdose of pills. She was hospitalized multiple times. Doctors diagnosed her with severe postpartum depression and psychosis. One of her psychiatrists, Dr. Mohammed Saeed, prescribed her antipsychotic medication called Haldol, which helped stabilize her. However, he also told Russell directly that Andrea should not have any more children, that another pregnancy would put her at serious risk of another breakdown. Russell and Andrea had another child anyway. Baby Mary was born in November 2000. Within weeks, Andrea began declining again. She was hospitalized again in March 2001, and then again in May 2001. Dr. Saeed discharged her from the hospital on May 14th, just 5 weeks before the deaths of her children. He had taken her off the Haldol. There is documented medical testimony confirming that Russell had been advised not to leave Andrea alone with the children. He later admitted to investigators that he had been leaving her alone with the kids in the weeks leading up to June 20th, believing it would help her become more independent. In the 5 weeks between her discharge and that Tuesday morning, Andrea was experiencing symptoms that her medical records and court testimony later confirmed in detail. She believed television cameras had been placed throughout her home to monitor the quality of her mothering. She believed a candy commercial was a direct message to her about being a bad parent. She believed that one and only Satan himself was literally living inside her body. She told none of this to Russell. She told none of it to her doctors. She kept it entirely to herself. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, Russell left for work between 8:30 and 9 in the morning. His mother was due to arrive at the house at 10 to help Andrea with the children. Andrea had exactly 1 hour alone with them. She went to the bathtub and filled it with water. She took each of her children to the bathroom one at a time, starting with the youngest 3, and held each one under the water until they lost consciousness. She placed the 4 youngest children in the bed afterward, covered them with a sheet as though they were sleeping, and left Noah in the bathtub. When 7-year-old Noah came looking for her during what was happening to his younger sister Mary, he saw enough to know something was terribly wrong and ran. Andrea chased him through the house, caught him, and brought him to the bathtub. He was found there when police arrived, while his 4 siblings were laid out in the bed under a blanket. After it was over, Andrea called Russell at work. She told him he needed to come home. He asked if anyone was hurt. She said yes. He asked who. She said the children. He asked which one. She said all of them. He drove home. She also called the police. An officer arrived, and Andrea answered the door, soaking wet, and told him directly, "I killed my kids." The responding officer found the 4 younger children in the bed. Noah was still in the bathtub. Andrea was calm. She was not screaming. She was not hysterical. She sat quietly and answered questions in full sentences. Investigators and mental health professionals who interviewed her in the days that followed described her mental state as severely deteriorated. One jail psychologist observed her talking to the wall in her cell and picking at her hair. A doctor who evaluated her the day after said she was catatonic before breaking down, screaming about whether her children could be forgiven for how she had raised them. Andrea had already told police why she did it. She believed her children were not developing properly under her care. She believed she was a bad mother, whose failures would condemn her children spiritually. She believed that if she ended their lives, they would be taken directly to a place of safety and peace. She also believed that once she called the police and confessed, she herself would face the most serious possible legal consequence, and that Satan, whom she believed was inside her, would face that same consequence alongside her. The legal case that followed became one of the most debated trials in recent American history. Prosecutors in Harris County charged Andrea with capital murder and pushed for the most serious possible outcome. Her defense team, led by attorney George Parnham, argued that she had been in a state of severe psychosis at the time and had no understanding that what she was doing was legally or morally wrong. Every single mental health expert who testified at her first trial, including those brought in by the prosecution, agreed that Andrea had been severely mentally ill at the time. The only disagreement was over whether, under Texas law, she met the specific legal standard for the insanity defense, which requires that the person did not know their actions were wrong. The prosecution's key expert witness was a forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Park Dietz. He argued that Andrea knew what she was doing was wrong, pointing to the fact that she waited until Russell left the house before acting, and that she called the police immediately after. He also testified that shortly before the events of June 20th, a specific episode of the television show Law and Order had aired featuring a mother who drowned her children and was later found not guilty on grounds of insanity, suggesting Andrea may have been influenced by it. That detail became central to the jury's decision. They deliberated for less than 4 hours and found her guilty of capital murder in March 2002. She was sentenced to life in prison. Then, in 2005, the entire conviction fell apart. An author named Suzanne O'Malley, who had been covering the trial for several publications, noticed something. She had previously written for Law and Order. She knew with certainty that the episode Dr. Dietz described did not exist. No such episode had ever aired. Dietz had given false testimony, whether intentionally or not, and it had directly influenced the jury. The Texas Court of Appeals overturned Andrea Yates's conviction in January 2005 and ordered a new trial. The second trial began in 2006. This time, the jury deliberated for 13 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity on July 26, 2006. The jury's foreman said afterward that it was very clear to all of them that Andrea had been in a state of psychosis before, during, and after the deaths of her children, and that she had not understood what she was doing was wrong within the meaning of the law. Andrea was transferred immediately to Vernon State Hospital, a secure mental health facility, and later moved to Kerrville State Hospital in Texas, where she remains to this day. She comes up for review for possible release every single year. Every single year, she waives the review herself and chooses to stay. She has told her attorney that she is afraid of the outside world and prefers the routine and safety of the facility. Russell Yates filed for divorce in 2004 while Andrea was still incarcerated. He remarried in 2006. He has spoken publicly about forgiving Andrea and placing the blame largely on the doctors who, he has said, failed to properly treat her in the months leading up to June 20th. Andrea Yates has now spent more than 2 decades inside a mental health institution. She participates in activities organised by the Yates Children Memorial Fund, a charity created in her children's names by her original defence attorney and his wife to raise awareness about postpartum mental illness. People who interact with her today describe her as gentle, quiet, and deeply aware of what happened. She has never sought to minimise it or explain it away. She is 60 years old. She will almost certainly spend the rest of her life inside Kerrville State Hospital. The case permanently changed how doctors, courts, and the public understood postpartum psychosis. It put a face on a condition that most people had never heard of and forced an entire legal system to grapple with what it means to hold someone responsible for actions taken inside a state of complete psychological collapse. 5 children went to bed safely the night of June 19, 2001, in a suburban Houston home. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary Yates never saw June 21st. Their mother, the woman who had carried each of them, nursed them, homeschooled them, and loved them according to every account from people who knew the family, took them from that bathtub one by one in the 1 hour between her husband leaving for work and her mother-in-law arriving at the front door. That is the permanent, unchangeable fact at the centre of everything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case we are covering involves a mother who also chose an ordinary Tuesday to act. But where Andrea Yates was driven by a mind that had completely broken from reality, this next mother was driven by something far more calculated. She wanted something specific, and her children were the most direct way to get it. Case 2. Susan Smith. Susan Lee Vaughan was born on September 26, 1971, in Union, South Carolina, a small mill town of about 10,000 people where everybody knew everybody and reputations travelled fast. Her childhood was not easy. Her father, Linda Russell, who she was very close to, took his own life when Susan was just 6 years old. That loss stayed with her. By the time she was a teenager, she had already attempted to take her own life once. She struggled with depression throughout her adolescent years, and court records and trial testimony later confirmed that she had been in a sexual relationship with her stepfather, Beverly Russell, who was a prominent figure in local Republican Party politics and the Christian Coalition from the time she was a teenager. That relationship, according to her defense team, continued well into her adult years, stopping only months before the events of October 1994. Susan married David Smith in 1991. They had met in high school. David was well liked in Union, described by friends and co-workers as steady and kind. Susan worked at Conso International, a textile company in town, where she eventually caught the attention of Tom Findley, the son of the company's wealthy owner. By the fall of 1994, Susan and David's marriage had fallen apart. They were separated. Both were seeing other people. Susan had developed strong feelings for Tom Findley and believed the relationship had a real future. She was working, she was raising 2 small boys largely on her own, and she was trying to hold everything together at once. Michael Daniel Smith was 3 years old in October 1994. His brother, Alexander Tyler Smith, called Alex by the family, was 14 months old. By all accounts from neighbours, teachers and family members, Susan loved her boys. People who knew her described her as attentive, affectionate, and genuinely devoted to Michael and Alex. There is nothing in the record suggesting she mistreated them in the years before October 1994. The boys were healthy, they were cared for, they had no idea what was coming. On October 25, 1994, Susan Smith buckled both her sons into their car seats in the back of her 1990 Mazda Protégé. It was a Tuesday evening. She drove approximately 5 miles from town to a spot near John D. Long Lake, a secluded local landmark outside Union. She stopped the car at the top of a boat ramp that sloped directly into the water. She got out of the car, reached in and released the handbrake, and stepped aside as the car began rolling down the ramp toward the lake. She stood and watched it go in. Investigators later determined the car took approximately 6 minutes to sink completely, carrying both boys, still strapped in their seats, to the bottom of the lake. Susan then ran to the nearest house, knocked on the door, and told the residents that a man had forced her out of her car at gunpoint and driven off with her children still inside. She described the man as a black male wearing a dark knit hat. She called 911. She told the operator the same story. And so began 9 of the most covered, most watched, most emotionally wrenching days in American television news in the 1990s. The story took off immediately. The image of 2 small boys potentially in the hands of a stranger gripped the entire country. Search teams fanned out across South Carolina. Tips poured in from across the nation. Union County Sheriff Howard Wells held daily press conferences that were broadcast on every major network. Susan and David Smith, despite being separated, stood together at those press conferences. Susan sobbed on camera. She appealed directly to whoever had her children, begging them to bring her boys back safely. David stood by her, heartbroken and desperate. America watched and prayed and searched along with them. What nobody outside a small circle knew was that on October 17th, 8 days before the boys disappeared, Tom Findlay had sent Susan a letter ending their relationship. He was direct about the reason. He told her that he was not ready for the responsibilities that came with dating someone who had children. He cared about her, the letter said, but he did not want to be a father figure. Prosecutors would later argue that this letter was the direct trigger for what Susan did on October 25th. By eliminating Michael and Alex, she removed the obstacle that she believed was standing between her and the life she wanted with Tom Findlay. Sheriff Wells had doubts from almost the beginning. He was a seasoned law enforcement officer who had grown up in Union County and knew its roads intimately. The intersection where Susan claimed the carjacking happened was at a red light in a residential area. It was not a place a carjacker would choose. There were no reported sightings of the car Susan described, despite the massive search. More significantly, Sheriff Wells noticed inconsistencies in Susan's story that changed slightly with each retelling. Her demeanour also struck him. She was emotional on camera, but in private conversations with investigators, she seemed oddly composed at times that did not add up. The racial dimension of Susan's false claim created immediate and serious tension in Union County. She had described her fictional attacker as a black man, and police were pulling over black men across the region based on her description. Community leaders in the black community in Union spoke out about the fear and hostility her accusation generated. Tommy Pope, the lead prosecutor on the case, has said in interviews decades later that he still thinks about what could have happened if police had arrested an innocent man based on her description. By November 2nd, 9 days after the boys disappeared, Sheriff Wells sat Susan down for a private interview. He pressed her on specific details of her story that did not hold up. He pointed out that the red light where the supposed carjacking happened was on a sensor and would not have turned red at that hour with no other cars present. That detail alone proved she had not been stopped at a red light where she claimed. Under that sustained pressure, Susan confessed. She told investigators what she had done and where the car was. Within hours, a dive team located the Mazda at the bottom of John D. Long Lake. Inside, in the back seat, still buckled into their car seats, were Michael and Alex Smith. They had been in the water for 9 days. David Smith was informed at the scene. Tommy Pope, who was also present, has described watching the car come up out of the water as one of the most devastating moments of his professional life. He has said he saw hardened law enforcement officers, men who had seen terrible things in their careers, openly crying at the edge of that lake. Susan was arrested immediately and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. David Smith publicly stated that he hoped she would receive the most serious possible punishment. The trial began in July 1995. Susan's defense team, which included attorney Judy Clark, who would go on to defend some of the most high-profile defendants in American legal history, including the Unabomber and the Boston Marathon bomber, argued that Susan was a deeply troubled woman whose history of trauma, depression, and abuse had severely impaired her judgment. They described her as someone who had driven to the lake to end her own life that night, and whose body had instinctively gotten out of the car before it went in, sparing herself without fully intending to. Prosecutors presented the Tom Findlay letter. They walked the jury through the timeline. They showed that Susan had taken her sons to that lake deliberately, had released the brake herself, and had then spent 9 days lying to the police, to David, and to the entire country. They argued this was not a woman who had snapped in a moment of crisis. This was a woman who made a choice, and then protected herself by pointing the finger at a person who did not exist. The jury deliberated for 2.5 hours before returning a guilty verdict on both counts of murder. During the penalty phase, prosecutors pushed for the most serious possible outcome. The jury voted against it. On July 22, 1995, Susan Smith was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms in prison. Under South Carolina law at the time, that meant she would be eligible for parole after serving 30 years. The community's reaction was complicated. Some people in Union expressed sympathy for Susan, focusing on her mental health history and the abuse she had experienced as a child and teenager. Others, including members of David's family, were clear that no amount of personal suffering explained or excused drowning 2 small children in a lake and then spending 9 days lying about it to their father and to the entire world. David Smith remarried and had more children. He has not spoken to Susan since shortly after her confession in 1994. He has stated publicly that he intends to fight her release every time she comes up for parole. Susan spent her years in prison in ways that damaged her credibility significantly. In 2000, she was caught in a sexual relationship with a prison guard. A second similar incident followed years later, involving another prison employee. These disciplinary violations became part of the record that the South Carolina Parole Board reviewed when her first eligibility hearing arrived. On November 20, 2024, exactly 30 years after her sons went into that lake, Susan Smith appeared before the South Carolina Department of Probation, Parole, and Pardon Services via video link from prison. She was 53 years old. She started by saying she was very sorry. She broke down crying partway through. She told the board that she knew what she had done was horrible and that she would give anything to go back and change it. She said God had forgiven her and asked the board to show the same mercy. 15 people opposed her release in person, including David Smith. He had a photograph of Michael and Alex pinned to his jacket. He told the board that Susan had no idea how much damage she had done to the people around her. He said her actions had come close to destroying him entirely in the aftermath. Other speakers included former prosecutors and law enforcement officials from the original case. Tommy Pope, now a South Carolina state representative, was among them. The board voted unanimously to deny parole. Susan Smith will be eligible to appear again in 2 years. The boys she strapped into those car seats on October 25, 1994, would be 33 and 31 years old today. Michael would be old enough to have children of his own. Alex would have just entered his early 30s. They have no grave at the bottom of John D. Long Lake. Their father went back to the ramp where the car went in after the trial. Reporters who were there at the time described watching him stand at the water and weep. Susan Smith is currently incarcerated at Leith Correctional Institution near Greenwood, South Carolina. She has spent more than 3 decades inside a cell for 9 minutes at the top of a boat ramp. The boys are buried together in Bogensville United Methodist Church Cemetery in Union County. They share a headstone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Where Susan Smith had a clear and specific reason that prosecutors were able to put in front of a jury, the next case involves a mother where the motive was completely different. Hua Her was not chasing someone else's attention or a wealthier life. She was living in a small public housing apartment in Minnesota, completely alone with 6 children and no way out. And what she did on September 3, 1998, still stands as one of the largest single-day losses of life by a parent in American history. Case 3. Hua He. Hua He was born on December 31st, 1973, in Laos. She never had a childhood in any real sense of the word. By the time she was 12 years old, she had already been through things that most people never experience in a lifetime. She was living in a refugee camp in Thailand, having fled Laos with her family as part of the massive displacement of the Hmong people that followed the end of the Vietnam War. It was in that camp, at age 12, that she was assaulted. Shortly after, still in the camp, she was married. She was a child. Before she turned 21, she had given birth to 6 children and immigrated to the United States with her husband, Tu Kong, and their family, settling in St. Paul, Minnesota. St. Paul had a significant Hmong community by the mid-1990s, one of the largest in the country, built from the waves of refugees who had arrived in the United States after 1975. But for Kua, the move did not bring the stability or safety that immigration was supposed to offer. The family ended up in McDonough Homes, a public housing complex in St. Paul that was known in the city for concentrated poverty, overcrowding, and limited social services. They were in a small apartment with 6 children ranging from toddler to pre-teen age. Kua had no car, no extended support network close by, limited English, and a marriage that had been deteriorating badly for years. The domestic situation between Kua and Tu Kong was serious enough that police had been called to their apartment at least 16 times between 1996 and 1998. Neighbours at McDonough Homes were familiar with the arguments that spilled out into the hallways and the street. By 1998, the marriage had effectively ended. Tu Kong had moved out. Kua was left in that apartment, alone, with 6 children, and no income that could cover what raising 6 children actually costs. The children ranged in age from 5 to 11. Their names were Kuei, Samson, Nali, Tang Lung, A, and Tang K. People in the community who knew the family described Kua as someone who clearly loved her children, but was overwhelmed in a way that had no easy solution. Officers from the ACOP program, a community outreach policing initiative assigned to work within the public housing complex, knew the family. One officer named Chaffee had responded to the apartment multiple times and said the children always struck him as sweet kids, that 11-year-old Kuai in particular was smart and responsible and always looked out for his younger siblings. That same officer said he never saw signs of violence from Kuai toward the children. What he saw was a woman who was barely managing. About a week before September 3rd, 1998, Tu Kong went to the ACOP office across the street from the apartment to report that he had gone to drop off food for the children and no one answered the door. The officer went over and found the children inside. Kuei told the officer that his mother had instructed them not to open the door for their father because, in Kuei's words, he was not their father anymore. The officer spoke to the boy about it and left. No further action was taken. On the afternoon of September 3rd, 1998, all 6 children were outside the apartment building together, playing in the common area. It was a regular afternoon. Kuei came outside and called Kuei, the oldest at 11, to come inside. He went in. What happened inside that apartment in the hours that followed was pieced together through Kuei's own confession to police and through the physical evidence investigators found when they arrived. Kuei took strips of black cloth and used them to end the lives of her children, one by one, calling each of them inside from the play area in the order of their age, oldest to youngest. Kuei first, then Samson, who was 9, then Nali, also 9, then Tang Lung, who was 7, then A, who was 6, then the youngest, Tang Ke, who was 5. The entire sequence took place over the course of that afternoon and into the early evening. At 7:17 in the evening, police received a 911 call. The woman on the line spoke broken English and reported that she had taken the lives of her children. The woman was Kua He. When first responders arrived at the apartment, they found Kua lying inside the front doorway. She was wearing a red ceremonial dress. She had an extension cord wrapped around her own neck. She had attempted to end her own life after the children were gone, but the cord had not been tight enough. She survived. The 6 children were found throughout the apartment. Kuei was found near the top of the stairs on the 2nd floor. The others were in various rooms. All 6 were gone. All 6 still had the black cloth around their necks. Investigators who responded to that apartment that night later described it as one of the most difficult scenes they had ever encountered professionally. A spokesperson for the St. Paul Police Department said at the time that officers who worked that case would never forget it. When police interviewed Kua at the hospital after she was stabilised, she explained what had driven her to it. She said she had decided to end her own life because she could not see any way forward. She was alone. She had no money. She had no support. She did not know how to navigate the American legal and social service systems well enough to get help. And she said that once she made the decision that she herself was going to die, she could not bring herself to leave the children without a mother. In her thinking, as her attorney later explained to the court, she believed that her children would go directly to a place of safety and peace if she ended their lives. That as a Christian, she believed they would go to heaven. She thought she was protecting them from a future without her. Her attorney, Patrick Wenger, described Kua in court as a loving mother who had reached a point of complete psychological collapse. He told the court that her intent was not driven by anger toward her children or a desire to harm them. He said she saw it as the only way to keep them safe from what she believed was a future full of suffering. Whether that reasoning made sense or not, it is what drove her. Child protection workers who later reviewed the family's situation confirmed that Kua had been living under extreme and prolonged stress, with almost no intervention from the systems that were supposed to be monitoring the family's welfare. The county prosecutor, Assistant Ramsey County Attorney Chris Wilton, decided not to take the case to a full jury trial. His reasoning was straightforward. With 12 jurors making the decision, the outcome was unpredictable, especially given the complexity of Kua's background, her mental state, and the cultural dimensions of the case. A plea agreement was reached. On December 1, 1998, Kua appeared in court and pleaded guilty to 6 counts of second-degree murder. When asked by the prosecutor to describe what she had done, she answered in 3 words. She said, "I strangled their necks." At her sentencing in January 1999, Kua addressed the court. She cried. She expressed that she understood the gravity of what she had done. Her attorney reiterated the circumstances of her life, the childhood in a refugee camp, the early forced marriage, the years of domestic problems, the complete isolation she had experienced in that apartment in the months before September 3rd. The prosecutor acknowledged the complexity, but also made clear that 6 children were gone and that no sentence could actually reflect that loss. Ramsey County Attorney Susan Gertner said publicly at the time that there was almost no way to make a decision that accounted for the loss of 6 young human lives. Judge Lawrence Cohen sentenced Kua to 50 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 33 years. She was 24 years old at sentencing. The case triggered a significant response from the Hmong community and from social service organizations across Minnesota. Community leaders who had known the family or who had worked in the public housing complex where they lived were vocal about what they saw as a catastrophic failure of the systems around the family. Ilian He, who was executive director of the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans at the time, said the case forced conversations about mental health within the Hmong community that had previously been too difficult to have publicly. She said the tragedy was the reason those conversations could no longer be avoided. Mental health advocates used the case to push for more culturally appropriate outreach and services within refugee and immigrant communities in Minnesota. The idea was that standard mental health services designed for the general population were not reaching families like Kua's, either because of language barriers, cultural stigma around mental illness, or simply because the families did not know those services existed or how to access them. The 6 children were buried together at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Maplewood on September 14, 1998, 11 days after they died. Hundreds of people from the Hmong community and the wider St. Paul area attended the burial. Their names were Kuai, Samson, Nali, Tanglung, A, and Tang Ke. The oldest was 11. The youngest had just turned 5. They had spent their afternoon playing outside together before their mother called the oldest one in. Tu Kong, the children's father, lost every one of his children on the afternoon of a regular school day in September. He had dropped off food at that apartment just a week before and found the children hiding inside. He had tried to maintain contact with them despite the collapsed marriage. He buried all 6 of them 11 days after they died. Kawa is currently incarcerated at the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee. She is 51 years old. Based on her sentence and parole eligibility, she has been eligible for potential release in recent years. The case remains one of the largest incidents of its kind in Minnesota history, and one of the most discussed in conversations about mental health, immigration, and the failure of social service systems to reach the most isolated families. The 6 children who died in that St. Paul apartment on September 3, 1998, were never given a future. Kawa, who was described by the community policing officer as smart and responsible, the kind of kid who stepped up and looked after the younger ones, was 11 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. So did Tanka, who was 5 and had barely started living at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case we are covering is set in a completely different world from McDonough homes. Marilyn Lemack lived in one of the wealthiest suburbs in Illinois, in a large home on a tree-lined street, with a physician husband and 3 children who were described by everyone in the neighborhood as bright, happy kids. But behind that picture, something was rotting, and on the night of March 4, 1999, she used her training as a surgical nurse to make sure all 3 of her children would never wake up again. Case 4. Marilyn Lemack. The house at 28 South Loomis Street in Naperville, Illinois, was the kind of home that people drove past and noticed. It was large, well-kept, and sat on a quiet residential street in one of the most consistently ranked best places to live in America. Naperville is a wealthy suburb about 30 miles west of Chicago, the kind of place where doctors and lawyers and business executives settle down to raise families. The Lemacks fit that picture perfectly on the outside. David Lemack was an emergency room physician at Hinsdale Hospital. Marilyn Lemack worked as a part-time surgical nurse. They had 3 children. Nicholas was 7, Emily was 6, Thomas was 3. Neighbours described them as devoted parents who took the kids for ice cream, went on bike rides as a family, and were always available if someone on the block needed help. Marilyn had a reputation in the neighbourhood for being kind and community-minded. When an elderly neighbour had health problems, Marilyn was the one who checked on her. Emily had recently been allowed to adopt a calico kitten after months of begging her parents. She liked to dress up in different costumes, a ballerina one day, a flower child the next, according to neighbours who knew her. Nicholas was the oldest, already in school and doing well. Thomas was the baby of the family, just 3 years old. From everything the people around them could see, this was a family that had built a good life. What the neighbours could not see was that the marriage had been quietly falling apart for years. David and Marilyn had a history of marital problems that stretched back to at least 1997, when Marilyn had filed for divorce on grounds of mental cruelty, before withdrawing the filing a few months later. Whatever brought them back together in 1997 did not hold permanently. By early 1999, David had made a decision. He was moving out. On February 11, 1999, he left the family home on South Loomis Street and moved into an apartment 2 blocks away. The separation hit Marilyn in a way that went beyond the ordinary pain of a marriage ending. She had built her entire identity around being David Lemack's wife and the mother of those 3 children. The house, the neighbourhood, the life they had constructed together, that was who she was. And now David was not just leaving, he had started seeing someone new. Her name was Janice Ryan. Marilyn found out about Janice in the weeks after David moved out, and according to prosecutors and testimony presented at trial, that discovery sent her into a rapid and dangerous downward spiral. She began making harassing phone calls to Janice Ryan. On February 19, 1999, less than 2 weeks after David moved out, Marilyn called Janice anonymously and told her either you can't have him or you can't have them. Janice filed a police report about the call. Marilyn also began leaving notes for David, including one that read, "What do you call someone who has a girlfriend while still married?" and then listed his name below it. She was seen driving past Janice's home. When she spotted Janice's car in the driveway of David's new apartment, she reportedly erupted. A friend named Tammy Bottigliero had a long conversation with Marilyn on the afternoon of March 4th, 1999, and found her in a deeply distressed state. Marilyn told Tammy she was not doing well. Tammy offered to come over and take the children so Marilyn could have some time alone. Marilyn declined. Bottigliero later testified that this conversation, which took place just hours before the children died, was the most disturbing interaction she had ever had with Marilyn. Something in her tone was different. Something felt wrong. Bottigliero's testimony became one of the most compelling pieces of evidence the prosecution offered at trial, because it showed that Marilyn's state of mind on March 4th was agitated and deliberate, not confused or dissociated. That same day, Marilyn Lemack went to her medication supply. As a surgical nurse, she had access to and detailed knowledge of pharmaceutical drugs and their effects on the body. She had been prescribed Ativan, an anti-anxiety medication in the benzodiazepine family, by her own doctors. Ativan, in the doses prescribed, is used to manage anxiety. In significantly higher doses, combined with other means, it becomes dangerous. Marilyn crushed multiple Ativan tablets into a fine powder. She went upstairs to where Emily and Thomas were. She gave them the crushed medication in their food. Once they were sedated and no longer conscious, she used her hands to end their lives. She then came back downstairs to where Nicholas had arrived home from school. Nicholas was 7 years old. She told him that Emily and Thomas would not be joining them for dinner. She made him a bagel and spread it with crunchy peanut butter. Into the peanut butter, she pressed the crushed Ativan powder. Nicholas ate it. Once he lost consciousness from the medication, she went to him and ended his life the same way she had ended his siblings. After all 3 children were gone, Marilyn attempted to end her own life. She took a large overdose of pills and slashed her own wrists. She then lay down in the house with her 3 dead children and lost consciousness. She was not successful. She woke up the next morning, March 5th, 1999, still alive. At that point, she called 911. The 911 call was recorded and played in court during pre-trial proceedings. On the tape, a thin, wavering voice said, "I did it. My husband didn't want us anymore." Police and paramedics arrived at South Loomis Street and found Marilyn still in the house, injured from her self-inflicted wounds, but alive. The 3 children were found in their beds. Emily and Thomas were in their own rooms. Nicholas had been placed in the master bedroom. Marilyn's wedding dress was on the floor nearby, spotted with blood. A photograph of David and Janice had been found, with Janice's face slashed out and an X-Acto knife inserted into the image at the point of David's chest. David Lemack was contacted and came to the scene. A neighbour who knew him described watching him arrive and learn what had happened as something they would never forget. He had gone from a man in the middle of a difficult but manageable divorce to a man who had lost all 3 of his children in the course of one phone call. Marilyn was taken to Edward Hospital in Naperville for treatment. She was placed under police guard. She was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The case was investigated by the newly formed DuPage County Major Crimes Task Force, which had been assembled from police departments across the county and which deployed approximately 20 investigators on the Lemack case. It was the first time the task force had been activated. Investigators documented everything: the medication, the method, the sequence in which the children died, the notes left for David, the harassing calls to Janice, the conversation with Tammy Bottigliero earlier that afternoon. Marilyn's legal team fought the case on the grounds of mental illness. They argued she had been suffering from a severe psychiatric breakdown at the time of the children's deaths, and that she could not be held fully criminally responsible. This was not an implausible argument on its face. Her mental state in the weeks after David moved out was genuinely deteriorated, and there was documented evidence of erratic behaviour and emotional collapse. However, prosecutors built a case that went directly at the claim that this was the action of a woman who had lost her grip on reality. Their argument was that everything Marilyn did on March 4, 1999, showed clear, careful planning. She had selected a medication she knew and had access to through her nursing work. She had crushed it. She had administered it in food she prepared specifically for each child. She had done it in a particular order. She had come downstairs to Nicholas with a prepared meal and a prepared explanation for why the younger ones were not at dinner. None of that, prosecutors argued, was the behaviour of someone in a dissociated or psychotic state. It was the behaviour of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it out methodically. The jury agreed. After deliberating for nearly 10 hours, they returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of murder. Several jurors spoke to reporters afterward and described the case in terms of deliberate revenge. One juror said Marilyn had been unable to manipulate David anymore and had looked for another way to make him suffer. Another said the jealousy and the anger were obvious throughout the evidence. Juror Latoris Collins, a 21-year-old single mother herself, said, "It was a heinous act. I had little sympathy for her." DuPage County Judge George Bacallis sentenced Marilyn Lamack to life in prison without the possibility of parole on May 30, 2002. Before handing down the sentence, he addressed her directly. He told her that it was appropriate that every day, as she looked at the walls and the bars around her, she would see the faces of her young children and hear their voices asking her why. He said he was ordering psychiatric services specifically so that she would always maintain the capacity to understand the horror of what she had done. He did not want her to find peace in confusion or decline. He wanted her to know. David Lamack did not give a public victim impact statement. He remarried and moved out of state. He sold the house on South Loomis Street in September 1999, 6 months after the children died, for $885,000. The new owners repainted it. The people who knew the children best, the neighbours who watched Emily in her costumes and Nicholas heading off to school each morning, and little Thomas being carried on his parents' shoulders. They still live on that street. The community that was, in the words of investigators, so shocked by what happened that it appeared to be the first triple homicide in Naperville's 160-year history, had to find a way to keep existing around the space where those 3 children used to be. Marilyn Lamack is currently serving her life sentence in an Illinois prison. She has sought to have her conviction overturned on multiple grounds, including arguments about juror bias and the constitutionality of Illinois' insanity standard. Every appeal has been rejected. Nicholas was 7, Emily was 6, Thomas was 3. Nicholas had come home from school that afternoon to a house where his mother had already made a decision about what the evening was going to bring. He ate the bagel she made for him, and he sat with her, and he did not know. Thomas was 3 years old and would not have understood anything that was happening. These were not children who had been neglected or hurt over a long period. They were, by every account from their teachers, their neighbours, and their father, healthy, happy, loved children whose lives were ended in a single night because their mother decided that hurting their father was worth more than their lives. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Marilyn Lamack's case was driven by rage at a husband who had moved on. The next case we are covering, Lauren Dickerson, also involved a marriage and a family in transition, but the circumstances were entirely different. The Dickersons had desperately wanted children for years, going through years of fertility treatment to have them, and the family had just arrived in a brand new country when Lauren did what she did on the night of September 16, 2021. Case 5. Lauren Dickerson. Lauren Ann Fawkes was born in South Africa and grew up in Pretoria. From the age of 15, she dealt with depression and anxiety, something her family was aware of and something that followed her through her teenage years and into adulthood. Despite those struggles, she was academically driven. She studied medicine at the University of Cape Town, one of the most respected medical schools on the African continent, and graduated with her medical degree in 2004. She went on to complete her rural health practice in Pretoria, which is where she met Graham Dickerson, an orthopedic surgeon, in 2005. They married and began building a life together. What Lauren wanted more than anything was to be a mother. That desire became the central and consuming focus of her life for years. Getting pregnant did not come easily. She and Graham went through the process of IVF, in vitro fertilization, 17 separate times. 17 attempts, with all the physical toll, the hormone treatments, the waiting, the repeated losses, the emotional cost of going through that cycle over and over again. When they finally had success, it required donor eggs. Their first child, a baby, died. That loss compounded everything Lauren had already been carrying emotionally. Eventually, they had 3 daughters. The oldest, Liane, was born first. Then came twins, Carla and Maya. Getting those 3 girls into the world had cost Lauren and Graham years of effort, grief, and physical strain. To people on the outside, the fact that Lauren had fought so hard and for so long to become a mother made what happened on September 16th, 2021, almost impossible to comprehend. Carla, one of the twins, had a cleft palate, a condition she was born with that required ongoing medical attention and made certain aspects of early parenting more demanding. Lauren found Carla difficult. She said so herself in conversations with doctors and in her own private records. She described Carla as a child who lashed out, who bit and slapped, who was hard to manage. Whether this was connected to Carla's medical condition or simply the ordinary chaos of raising twins alongside a young child, Lauren's patience with her own children had been eroding for years by the time the family arrived in New Zealand. In May 2019, 2 years before the deaths of her daughters, Lauren saw a psychiatrist after experiencing what she described as thoughts of harming her children. That appointment was triggered after she and a nanny struggled to put the twins to bed one evening, and Lauren felt something shift inside her that frightened her. That 2019 episode was documented. She received some treatment, but the thoughts did not permanently go away. The Dickerson family had planned to emigrate to New Zealand in August 2020. Graham had secured a position as an orthopaedic surgeon at Timaru Hospital on the South Island. The move was delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic and by immigration complications. That delay extended the period of uncertainty and stress for the family significantly. During the pandemic months, Lauren experienced further episodes of depression and suicidal thoughts. Her mother and other family members were aware she was struggling. They believed she was receiving appropriate treatment and monitoring. The family finally arrived in New Zealand on August 28, 2021. They spent 2 weeks in managed isolation, as was required by New Zealand's COVID-19 border policy at the time. When they were released from isolation, they travelled to Timaru, a small coastal city of about 29,000 people on the South Island's east coast. Graham began his new job. The children started at new schools and preschools. Liane, who was 6, attended Timaru Christian School. The twins, who had just turned 2, started at a local preschool. The family was 3 weeks into their new life in a new country when September 16th arrived. In the weeks between arriving in Timaru and that night, Lauren's mental state had been deteriorating in ways that the trial later examined in extensive detail. Her search history in the weeks before September 16th included searches about harmful situations involving children. She had responded to a TikTok video in July 2021, weeks before leaving South Africa, that showed a stressed mother describing the mental chaos of parenting. Lauren's response to that video, recovered from her phone, said, "Awesome, XX, that's exactly how I feel." She was experiencing what trial experts later described as vivid and distressing thoughts about harm, thoughts she found disturbing, but that kept returning regardless. On September 16, 2021, it was the twins' first full day at preschool and Liane's second day at her new school. Lauren picked all 3 girls up that afternoon. On the drive home, Carla had a tantrum in the car. Later in the afternoon, the family went for a walk at the local botanical gardens. During that outing, Lauren told police in a subsequent interview she noticed a group of girls who she believed were warning her that a boy in the park was photographing her children. She interpreted this as evidence that New Zealand was as dangerous as South Africa. That perception, which other people present at the gardens did not share and which police found no basis for, reflected the degree to which her thinking had become disconnected from reality by that point. That evening, Graham went out to dinner with work colleagues, something entirely ordinary for someone who had just started a new job and was building professional relationships. Lauren was alone with the 3 girls. She told police in her interview afterward that the children were being wild, jumping on the couches and not listening to her. Sometime that night, with Graham out and the 3 girls in their pyjamas, Lauren smothered all 3 of her daughters in their beds. Liane was 6, Carla and Maya were 2. Lauren then harmed herself. Graham returned home later that night. He found his 3 daughters dead in their beds and his wife in the house. He called his colleague Mark Civitanich and his wife, who responded immediately. Civitanich also called police and emergency services. Neighbours Karen and Brad Cowper responded to a distressed Graham outside the house. Police in Timaru arrived at 10 p.m. and found the 3 dead children and Lauren, who was taken to Timaru Hospital and admitted in stable condition. The following morning, September 17th, police interviewed Lauren Dickerson. She admitted to them that she had ended the lives of all 3 of her daughters. Detective Inspector Scott Anderson confirmed publicly that day that police had arrested a 40-year-old woman in connection with the deaths and that they were not seeking anyone else. It was an isolated incident. Graham was not a suspect. Lauren appeared in the Timaru District Court on September 18th and was remanded to a forensic psychiatric ward at Hillmorton Hospital in Christchurch. Her lawyer, Karen Beaton, entered a not guilty plea on her behalf, on the basis that while Lauren did not deny she had ended the girls' lives, she was contesting that it constituted murder given her mental state at the time. Her defence was built on 2 grounds: insanity and infanticide. The infanticide provision under New Zealand law applies when a woman causes the death of a child under 10 years old in a manner that amounts to culpable homicide, and where the balance of her mind was disturbed at the time by reason of not having fully recovered from the effects of giving birth. The trial began on July 17, 2023, at the Christchurch High Court, more than a year and a half after the deaths. It ran for 5 weeks and heard evidence from a substantial number of expert witnesses on both sides. The prosecution argued that Lauren had ended her daughters' lives out of anger, resentment, and a need for control, including a desire to prevent another woman from raising her girls if she herself were to die. They pointed to her search history, her documented thoughts going back to 2019, and what they described as a pattern of thinking that was calculating rather than psychotic. The Crown's position was that whatever mental illness Lauren had, she understood what she was doing, and she knew it was wrong. Defence expert witnesses, including forensic psychiatrist Dr. Justin Barry Walsh, testified that Lauren was in the grip of a rapidly worsening depression and a negative worldview so severe that she had come to believe that what she was doing was morally correct. He said she believed at the time that ending her daughters' lives seemed right. Another expert who spent approximately 20 hours with Lauren after the event described her account of the night as consistent with someone who was not in contact with rational thought. The jury heard all of it. They also heard about Lauren's documented history, the years of fertility treatment, the death of her first child, the postnatal depression after the twins, the 2019 episode in which she had reported violent thoughts and seen a psychiatrist, the deterioration during the pandemic, the web searches in the weeks before September 16th. They deliberated for more than 14 hours. On August 16th, 2023, by a majority verdict, the jury found Lauren Dickerson guilty of 3 counts of murder. The insanity and infanticide defences were rejected. Graham Dickerson gave evidence during the trial via audio-visual link from Pretoria, having returned to South Africa after the deaths. He described his wife during the trial as someone who had been quieter and more reserved in the period leading up to September 16th. He said he was frustrated that his start date at the hospital had been brought forward. He spoke about his daughters. He did not attend the sentencing. The sentencing took place on June 26, 2024, at the High Court in Christchurch. It was one of the most emotionally charged court hearings New Zealand had seen in years. Graham's mother, Betty Dickerson, gave a victim impact statement in which she said she did not have the vocabulary to accurately describe the pain that had been brought upon her and her family. She said she was a 78-year-old grandmother who had once had 10 grandchildren and now had 7. She said some days it felt unbelievable, like living in a horror film she could not wake up from. Graham's own victim impact statement was read in court. He said he had lost everything with the loss of his daughters and his life with Lauren. He said he had made the decision to forgive Lauren. He said her punishment was already severe because she would have to live with the knowledge of what she had done for the rest of her life. Lauren's own family gave statements in support of her. A close family member said it was clear the person who had ended those 3 girls' lives was not the mother, doctor, or woman they knew Lauren to be. They said the greatest victim in the situation may be Lauren herself. The family was also vocal about their anger at the various agencies and individuals they believed had failed to detect the severity of Lauren's mental health struggles before September 16th. Justice Cameron Mander considered all of it. He acknowledged that ordinarily the loss of 3 children would point decisively toward the most serious possible sentence. He also had to weigh Lauren's severe mental illness, which he accepted was not only a contributing factor, but the primary cause of what happened. He ruled that imposing the maximum possible sentence in this case would be manifestly unjust. On June 26, 2024, he sentenced Lauren Dickerson to 18 years in prison. He set no minimum non-parole period, meaning she is technically eligible for parole after serving 1/3 of her sentence. She will begin her time in an inpatient care and treatment facility under the Mental Health Compulsory Assessment and Treatment Act, housed as a special patient rather than in a standard prison setting. Shortly after the sentence was handed down, Lauren released a written statement. She said she loved her daughters with all of her heart. She said she had failed them, failed Graham, and failed their families. She said she took full responsibility for taking 3 beautiful girls from the world. She expressed remorse. She said their names. Graham Dickerson is in South Africa. He has expressed that he holds no ill will toward Lauren. He has said publicly that he was pleased she was receiving mental health care in New Zealand. He has also said clearly that the real victims are Liani, Maya, and Carla, and that they will be missed forever. Liani Dickerson was 6 years old when she died in her bed in Timaru on the night of September 16, 2021. Maya and Carla were 2. The family had arrived in New Zealand 19 days earlier. The girls had been at their new school and preschool for exactly 1 or 2 days. They had their whole New Zealand lives ahead of them. A new country, a new home, new friends they had not yet made. None of it happened. Lauren Dickerson is currently held at Hill Morton Hospital in Christchurch, receiving psychiatric care as a special patient. The case remains one of the most discussed in New Zealand's recent history, particularly around the questions it raised about what happens when a person's mental health deteriorates in ways that the people around them can see but cannot seem to stop. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Where Lauren Dickerson's case was defined by a long and documented history of mental illness that ultimately overwhelmed everything around it, the next case we are covering is something entirely different. Christy Sheets was not described by the people around her as someone who had lost touch with reality. She was described as someone who was angry, calculating, and who called a family meeting on a Friday afternoon in Texas specifically to do what she had already decided to do. Case 6. Christy Sheets. Fulshear, Texas is a small city about 30 miles west of Houston in Fort Bend County. It is the kind of place where people move to get away from the noise of the city, where neighborhoods are quiet, where people know their neighbors and feel safe leaving their doors unlocked. In 2016, it was consistently ranked as one of the safest cities in Texas. The Sheets family lived there in a house on a residential street, and by the accounts of friends and neighbors, they looked like a family that had built a comfortable and stable life. Jason Sheets and Christy Sheets had been married for more than 20 years by the summer of 2016. They had 2 daughters. Taylor Sheets was 22 years old and was engaged to be married. Her wedding was scheduled for just days after June 24th. Madison Sheets was 17 and would have been a senior in high school in the fall. By the time that Friday afternoon was over, both girls would be gone. Jason would be the only member of his immediate family still alive, and Christy would be dead on the street outside their house, shot by a Fulshear police officer after she refused to put down her weapon. Christy Sheets had a documented history of mental health struggles going back years. She had been admitted to a private mental health facility on 3 separate occasions for attempting to take her own life. She was being treated for depression and was taking multiple prescription medications at the time of her death. Fort Bend County Sheriff Troy Nels confirmed these details publicly in a press conference held on June 29, 2016, 5 days after the shooting. Nels also confirmed that there had been prior calls for service at the Sheets residence, meaning police had been to that house before June 24th for reasons connected to the family. Jason Sheets told investigators that his wife had begun what he described as a downward spiral in 2012, following the death of her grandfather, to whom she had been very close. Her grandfather was the person who had given her the gun she used on June 24th. 2 months after her grandfather died, her mother also passed away. Those two losses, in quick succession, deepened her depression significantly, according to Jason's account to police. There were also serious marital problems. Jason and Christy had been heading toward divorce. Jason believed that the family meeting Christy called on the afternoon of June 24th was going to be the moment she told their daughters that their parents were separating. He had no idea what she was actually planning. Neither did Taylor or Madison. Christy had also had a specific conflict with Taylor in the days immediately before June 24th. Taylor was 22 years old, a grown adult, and was engaged. Christy had gotten into an argument with her and had tried to ground her and prevent her from seeing her fiancé, an action that Jason had pushed back on, telling Christy she could not ground a 22-year-old. That argument sat unresolved in the days leading up to the Friday of the shooting. Whether it was a contributing factor to what Christy decided to do that afternoon is something only Christy could have answered, and she never got the chance to answer it to investigators. On the afternoon of Friday, June 24, 2016, Christy Sheets called a family meeting. She gathered Jason, Taylor, and Madison together in the living room of their Fulshire home. All 4 of them sat down. What happened next was described to investigators by Jason, who was the only person in that room who survived. Christy produced a .38 caliber 5-shot revolver. She opened fire on her daughters inside the house. Jason managed to get Taylor and Madison out through the front door. Both girls collapsed in the street outside. Christy came back inside the house, and investigators determined she reloaded her weapon, a deliberate action that requires conscious thought and physical steps, before coming back outside. She fired again at Taylor in the street. A neighbour had already called 911. Police and sheriff's deputies responded to the scene. When law enforcement arrived, Christy was outside with the weapon. Officers ordered her repeatedly to put it down. She did not comply. She advanced toward officers with the gun still in her hand. A Fulshire police officer fired 1 shot, and Christy Sheets was pronounced dead at the scene. Taylor Sheets died at the scene in the street. She was 22 years old. Her wedding was days away. Madison Sheets was transported to a hospital and died from her injuries. She was 17 years old and would have started her senior year of high school in the fall. Jason Sheets was not physically harmed. He was taken to a hospital afterward because of his emotional state. Law enforcement described him from the beginning as a victim, not a suspect. Sheriff Nels held a detailed press conference on June 29, 2016, in which he laid out the motive as Jason had described it to investigators. Nels stated directly that Jason told police his wife knew how much he loved Taylor and Madison, and how much they loved him. By ending their lives, Nels said, Christy ensured that Jason would have to carry that horror for the rest of his life. She had ample time and opportunity to shoot Jason as well, Nels confirmed, and she chose not to. He was right there in that room. She did not fire at him. The decision to leave Jason alive while taking both daughters was not an accident. It was the point. That detail is the core of what made this case so deeply disturbing to the investigators, the prosecutors who reviewed it, and the public who followed it. This was not a woman who lost control in a moment of rage and harmed people without thinking. She called a meeting. She gathered everyone together. She made sure Jason was in the room to watch. She reloaded. She had thought about what she was doing and decided that the specific outcome she wanted was for Jason to survive and carry the weight of losing both of his daughters forever. Fort Bend County Sheriff Nels said publicly that in his assessment, she accomplished what she set out to do. Christy had also had a public presence on social media in the years before her death that added a layer of complexity to the story. She had posted repeatedly about her support for gun rights, including a post stating that it would be tragic if Americans were ever prevented from being able to protect themselves and their families if their weapons were taken away. That post circulated widely after June 24th and became a significant part of the public conversation about the case. There were also reports that Christy had been investigated or flagged in connection with a license to carry permit application at some point before June 24th, with investigators looking into claims that she may have been denied a permit due to her mental health history. Fort Bend County authorities confirmed they were examining that angle as part of their investigation, but did not release full details. The picture that emerged from the investigation was of a woman who had been in significant psychological pain for years, who had attempted to take her own life 3 times, who was medicated and in treatment, and whose marriage was ending. None of that is unusual in isolation. What made Christy Sheets' case extraordinary was the decision she made about what to do with that pain. She did not direct it at herself. She did not direct it at Jason. She directed it at the 2 people whose loss would cause Jason the most permanent damage possible, and she made sure he was standing there to witness it. Jason Sheets gave no press interviews in the immediate aftermath. He authorized the sheriff's office to speak on his behalf and confirmed the account they gave. He has kept an extremely low public profile since June 24, 2016. The details of his life after that date are largely private, which is entirely understandable given what he witnessed on that Friday afternoon. Taylor Sheets' fiancée lost the woman he was supposed to marry within days of their wedding. The specifics of his name and circumstances were not widely reported, out of respect for his privacy during the investigation. Taylor was described by people who knew her as vibrant and excited about the life ahead of her. She was 22 years old. Madison was described as a bright kid, looking forward to her senior year. She was 17. Friends of Christy from outside Texas also spoke publicly in the days after the shooting. A woman named Catherine Knowles, who had been close to Christy for years, told Time magazine that Christy had lived for her children. Knowles said that Christy constantly talked about Taylor and Madison, showed off their photos, and that being their mother was her life's purpose and her greatest joy. Knowles said she did not recognize the person who did what Christy did on June 24th as the Christy she knew. That disconnect between the person friends remembered and the reality of what happened on that Friday is something that comes up in almost every account from people who knew the Sheets family. The investigation was handled by the Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office. Because Christy was killed by a police officer at the scene, and both daughters also died, there was no criminal trial. The legal process centered on the investigation and documentation of the events, rather than prosecution, since the only adult who had committed a crime was already dead. The officer who fired the shot that ended Christy's life was determined to have acted appropriately under the circumstances, having responded to an active armed threat who was advancing after repeated commands to stop. What remained after the investigation closed was a family that had been destroyed from the inside. Jason Sheets survived June 24, 2016, but the life he had built over 20 years with Christy, the family they had made together, the daughters who had grown up in that house in Fulshear, none of that survived with him. Taylor would have been a married woman by the end of June. Madison would have graduated from high school in 2017. Neither of those things happened. Fort Bend County, Texas, processed the deaths officially and closed the case as a murder-suicide, with Christy Sheets identified as the perpetrator and Jason Sheets identified as a surviving victim. The community in Fulshear, a city that had prided itself on being one of the safest in Texas, held memorials for Taylor and Madison. A Facebook page set up in memory of Michael and Alexander Smith after the Susan Smith case had drawn thousands of followers over the years. After June 24, 2016, similar memorial pages for Taylor and Madison Sheets drew immediate attention from people across the country who had followed the news of that Friday afternoon. Taylor Sheets is buried. Madison Sheets is buried. The wedding that was supposed to happen days after June 24th never happened. Jason Sheets lives with what he saw in that living room in Fulshear on his wife's chosen Friday, a fact that Christy, according to the investigators who reviewed the case, had calculated precisely before she ever called that family meeting. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Where Christy Sheets acted in a single explosive afternoon that was over within minutes, the next case we are covering unfolded in a completely different way. Carol Coronado had 3 daughters under the age of 3 in a home in the Los Angeles area. And what happened on the afternoon of May 20th, 2014 was discovered not by police arriving at a scene, but by her own mother, who walked in and had to physically wrestle a knife out of her daughter's hands. Case 7. Carol Coronado. The city of Carson sits in the South Bay region of Los Angeles County, a working-class community of about 90,000 people wedged between Torrance, Compton, and the 405 freeway. It is not a wealthy area. It is the kind of neighborhood where people work long hours, raise families in modest homes, and get by without a lot of extra margin. The Coronado family lived in a house on West 223rd Street in the unincorporated area near Carson, and by the accounts of the people around them, they were an ordinary young family doing their best with what they had. Rudy Coronado worked outside the home. Carol Ann Coronado was 30 years old in May 2014 and was staying home to raise their 3 daughters. Those daughters were very young. Sophia was 2 years old, Yasmin was 16 months old, Xenia was 2 months old. 3 children under the age of 3, all under the same roof, all entirely dependent on the adults around them. Carol was their primary caregiver every day while Rudy was at work. What the people around the Coronado family did not fully understand, and what became central to everything that followed legally, was the state Carol had been in since the birth of her youngest daughter Xenia 2 months earlier. Her defense team later argued extensively that Carol had been suffering from severe postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis following Xenia's birth, a condition they said had gone undetected and untreated to a catastrophic degree. Whether that argument fully explained what happened on May 20th, 2014 was something a judge would ultimately decide. But the question of Carol's mental state in the weeks before that afternoon was real, and it was documented. On the afternoon of May 20th, 2014, Rudy Coronado was outside the house. He was in the yard or working near the property. He was physically present on the premises, but not inside with Carol and the girls. At approximately 5:10 in the afternoon, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department received a call from family members at the scene. By the time the call came in, Carol's mother had already arrived at the house. What Carol's mother found when she entered that house was something no parent should ever have to witness. Carol had harmed all 3 of her daughters with a knife inside the home. Her mother grabbed the knife from Carol's hand. She physically wrestled it away from her. When Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies arrived, they found Carol's 3 daughters with life-threatening injuries inside the house. Sophia, Yasmin, and Xenia were all transported to hospitals. Sophia and Yasmin could not be saved. Xenia, the 2-month-old, also did not survive. Carol was found at the scene in a state that investigators and paramedics described as severely distressed. She was taken to a hospital herself. She was not immediately arrested because of her medical condition, but the investigation began that afternoon, and it moved quickly. The physical evidence inside the house was clear and contained. There was no sign of an intruder. There was no sign of a break-in. Rudy Coronado cooperated fully with investigators from the beginning and was never a suspect. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department charged Carol Ann Coronado with 3 counts of murder with the special circumstance of multiple murders. The district attorney's office decided not to seek the most serious possible legal outcome in terms of penalty, but the charges themselves were as serious as they could be. Carol was also charged with 1 count of attempted murder related to an allegation that she had also planned to harm her mother, who had interrupted what was happening by arriving at the house. That attempted murder charge was ultimately not proven, and Carol was acquitted of it. The legal process that followed took more than a year. Carol's defense team built their case entirely on the question of her mental state. They argued that postpartum psychosis is a recognized and serious psychiatric condition that can cause a person to lose complete contact with reality, to experience hallucinations, to act in ways that bear no relationship to their baseline character, and to do things that they would never do under any other circumstances. They pointed to the timeline, the fact that Xenia had been born just 2 months before May 20th, and argued that Carol's mental health had collapsed in those 2 months, in ways that neither she nor Rudy had been equipped to recognize or address. Rudy Coronado made his position public very early, and maintained it throughout the entire legal process. He believed his wife was not in her right mind when it happened. He said so publicly outside the courthouse during the trial. He told reporters that she had lost her mind, that she did not mean to do what she did, that he had lost his 3 little girls and also lost Carol in the same event, and that the family had been destroyed in every direction at once. He said he was a realist and understood the disease of postpartum psychosis. He had forgiven her. He continued to support her through the trial and afterward. The trial was heard by a superior court judge, sitting without a jury, meaning the judge alone evaluated the evidence and made the determination. This is known as a bench trial, and it happens in cases where the defense and prosecution agree to proceed that way. Judge distributed the case carefully over several months. The prosecution did not accept the postpartum psychosis argument as a defense to the murder charges. Their position was that Carol had acted deliberately, and that whatever mental health struggles she may have had, she understood what she was doing at the time. They also noted that she had planned to harm her mother as well, which suggested a level of intent that went beyond the loss of contact with reality that postpartum psychosis is associated with. The acquittal on the attempted murder charge related to her mother complicated that argument somewhat, but the prosecution maintained their position on the 3 murder counts throughout. The judge found Carol Ann Coronado guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder in November 2015. The special circumstance finding of multiple murders was included in the verdict. Her defense attorney Stephen Allen said immediately after the verdict that he intended to seek a new trial and file an appeal, arguing that Carol should have been sent to a mental health institution rather than convicted of murder. He pointed to the evidence of her suffering and said the system had failed a woman who was genuinely and severely ill. Rudy Coronado repeated outside the